Harold Bennett had not heard his old dog bark in nearly 3 years. At 12, Rusty was more gray than brown now, stiff in the mornings, blind in one eye, and almost completely deaf. Age had softened him. The cattle no longer bothered to move when he shuffled past. He slept through thunderstorms, tractor engines, and sometimes even Harold calling his name from a few feet away. For the most part, Rusty had retired himself from farm life and taken up permanent residence on the faded rug beside the wood stove. So when Harold woke just after midnight to find the old dog standing rigid at the back door, head lifted, mouth open in a long broken howl, every hair on his arm stood up. It was not a normal sound. Rusty used to bark sharp and deep in his younger days, the kind of bark that scattered raccoons from feed bins and warned coyotes off the lower pasture. But this was something else, raw, strained, almost rusty with disuse, as if it hurt him to make it. He threw his head back and did it again, staring not at the yard but toward the barn. Harold sat up in bed too fast and reached for his glasses on the nightstand. Beside him, his wife June stirred beneath the blankets. "What on earth?" Harold didn't answer. At 64, he had spent his entire life on that Iowa farm, and one thing he had learned early was to trust old animals when they broke their habits, especially at night. Rusty howled again. June pushed herself up on one elbow. He hasn't done that in years. "I know." Harold swung his feet to the floor and pulled on his work pants over long johns. Outside, the March wind hissed against the house siding. There was no rain, but the air had that late winter bite that crept into your joints. The moon was thin and pale over the east pasture, throwing just enough light across the frozen yard to turn everything silver. Rusty didn't wait for Harold to open the door. The old dog pawed at it, whining low in his throat, then trotted out as fast as his stiff legs would allow. Harold grabbed the flashlight from the mudroom hook and followed. The barn stood 50 yards from the house, black against the open fields. One side of it had been rebuilt after a storm 6 years earlier, but the back wall was still the original timber and stone from Harold's grandfather's time. The place held feed, tack, tools, and two geldings too old to work hard anymore. At that hour, the horses should have been quiet, shifting now and then in their stalls, but tonight they were restless. Harold could hear them moving inside before he reached the door, hooves scraping, a nervous snort, the heavy thud of a body brushing wood. Rusty ignored the main entrance completely. Instead, he rounded the corner of the barn and stopped at the rear wall where stacked hay bales and an old rusted plow sat under a lean-to roof. There he began howling again, facing the wall itself, claws scratching at the frozen dirt beneath it. Harold's pulse quickened. "What is it, boy?" Rusty didn't look at him. He kept pawing and crying, every movement urgent and wrong for a dog that usually needed help climbing porch steps. Harold swept the flashlight beam across the wall. At first he saw nothing unusual: old boards, a stone foundation, shadows from the lean-to posts, two coils of hose hanging on a nail. Then the beam dropped lower and caught a narrow, dark gap near the base of the foundation where one of the stones had shifted outward. And from that gap came a faint sound, a tiny, desperate cry. Harold went still. Not a cat, not a raccoon, human. He lunged forward and dropped to one knee in the dirt, pressing the flashlight closer to the opening. The beam showed only blackness and splintered wood for a second. Then movement, something pale, a small hand. Harold recoiled so fast he nearly fell. "Oh my God!" "Harold!" June's voice came thin through the dark from the house porch behind him. She had followed in her coat and boots after all. "What is it?" He couldn't seem to get enough air. "Call 911. June ran. Harold shoved aside the plow handle and yanked two loose hay bales away from the wall. Rusty kept whining, circling, then pressing his nose toward the gap. Harold flattened himself and looked again. A child lay wedged in the crawl space behind the barn wall. The boy couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. He was on his side in the dirt, half buried under broken boards and old insulation, face streaked with dust, lips blue from cold. One arm was pinned awkwardly beneath a slab of collapsed timber. His eyes fluttered when Harold's light found him. "Hey," Harold said, voice shaking despite himself. "Hey, son, can you hear me?" The boy made a weak sound. Harold recognized him then and turned pale exactly as he would later describe to the sheriff. It was Caleb Turner, the Turner boy from the farm 2 miles east. He had been missing since late afternoon. The whole county had been looking. Harold had joined the search himself before supper, driving fence lines and creek banks with 3 other men while deputies checked roads and ditches. Caleb had last been seen chasing the family's new barn kitten after getting off the school bus. By sunset, with temperatures dropping fast, everyone had grown afraid. Search teams were still out there now with ATVs and thermal drones. And all that time, the boy had been trapped less than a football field from Harold's own kitchen. "Stay with me, Caleb," Harold said hoarsely. "You stay with me, you hear?" The child blinked once, slow and glassy. June came running back around the barn. "They're on the way. They said don't move him unless—" She saw the gap and stopped dead, one hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Lord. He's pinned. Can you reach him?" "Not from here." Harold stood and aimed the flashlight higher, trying to understand the space behind the wall. Decades earlier, before the barn had been expanded, that rear section had apparently covered a shallow maintenance trench along the foundation. Over time, it must have been boarded over and forgotten, but some of the rotten planks had collapsed inward recently, leaving a hidden cavity. Caleb had likely been exploring around the back of the barn, maybe following tracks or an animal, stepped through the weak boards beside the wall and slid down into the narrow space. Once the timber shifted, he would have been too trapped to climb out and too muffled for anyone in the open yard to hear. Except Rusty. The old dog began scratching furiously again at the dirt by the foundation. Harold looked at him in disbelief. You heard him. Or maybe not heard, not exactly. Felt him, smelled him, sensed the strange distress from somewhere age had not stolen. The minutes before the rescue felt endless. June brought blankets from the house. Harold found a crowbar and tried to pry away loose boards without jarring the cavity. Caleb moaned once when the timber shifted and Harold backed off instantly. The last thing he wanted was to bring the wall down on the boy. Within 10 minutes, the first deputy arrived, then the volunteer fire crew from Mill Creek, then the ambulance. Red and blue lights washed over the barnyard and pasture fence. Searchers who had been combing nearby roads came tearing in by truck and ATV, faces tight and stunned when they heard where the missing boy had been found. Caleb's mother arrived before the extrication team even finished unloading tools. Her scream cut through the whole yard. Deputy Lawson caught her before she could throw herself at the wall. June wrapped both arms around her and held on while the woman sobbed Caleb's name into June's shoulder. Fire Captain Wes Malloy took one look at the foundation and swore softly. "All right, nobody touches anything now except us." They worked with remarkable speed and maddening caution. Portable floodlights went up. A stabilization brace was set against the wall. One firefighter crawled onto his stomach to assess Caleb through the gap, while another used a camera snake to inspect the cavity from above. The worst concern was crush injury. If the timber had pinned the boy for too long, moving it wrong could do terrible damage. There was also the cold. Caleb had likely been down there for 7 hours in near freezing temperatures. Harold stood back only because they made him. Rusty did not. The old dog refused to leave the foundation. He stood beside the firefighters, whining, tail low, body trembling, until one of them finally let him remain under Harold's hand at a safe distance. "Good old boy," the firefighter murmured. "Good old boy." At last they had enough access to begin. A hydraulic spreader lifted the heaviest board by inches while a paramedic reached in to secure Caleb's neck and check his breathing. Another firefighter widened the lower opening just enough for space. Dirt crumbled. Someone shouted to hold steady. Caleb cried out weakly when the timber came off his arm, and everyone in the yard seemed to inhale at once. Then the paramedic said the words Harold would never forget. "We've got him. We've got him." They slid Caleb out wrapped in insulation blankets and into waiting arms. He looked impossibly small under the lights. One arm hung limp. His face was waxy with cold, but he was alive, conscious enough to whimper when his mother bent over him crying. The paramedics moved fast: oxygen, thermal wrap, IV line, quick trauma checks, possible broken forearm, hypothermia, dehydration, concussion maybe, but alive, alive. As they loaded Caleb into the ambulance, his mother turned back once toward Harold, June, and Rusty. She was crying too hard to speak. She only pressed both hands over her mouth and nodded with a kind of desperate gratitude that said more than language would have managed. Then the doors closed and the siren carried them away into the night. The yard fell strangely still after that. The lights remained and deputies still took statements, and Captain Malloy still marked the collapse zone with hazard tape, but the great tension had broken. Search volunteers leaned against trucks in shaky exhaustion. June passed around coffee and mismatched mugs to whoever needed it. Someone from the Turner farm called with the first update from the hospital. Caleb was stable. Only then did Harold remember to kneel beside Rusty. The old dog's legs nearly buckled with fatigue the moment it was over. Harold caught him under the chest and lowered him gently onto the straw-scattered dirt. Rusty leaned into him with a tired groan, eyes milky in the floodlights, muzzle silver as frost. "You stubborn old fool," Harold whispered, voice rough. "You knew." June crouched beside them and stroked the dog's back. "He saved that child." Word spread fast, as it always does in the country. By sunrise, everyone within 20 miles knew that old deaf Rusty from the Bennett farm had found the missing Turner boy. By afternoon, the local radio station had called. By evening, someone from Des Moines wanted a quote for a human interest piece. Harold declined all of it. June gave one short statement to the county paper because she knew people would ask anyway. "Rusty hasn't barked proper in years," she told them. "Last night he decided it mattered." At the hospital, doctors confirmed Caleb had a fractured arm, mild hypothermia, and bruising, but no internal injuries that would keep him from healing. One more night in that crawl space, they said, or even a few more hours in the deeper cold before dawn, and the story could have ended very differently. When Caleb was stronger, he explained in scraps what had happened. He had seen a barn cat squeeze behind the Bennett barn while he was cutting across the fields, after wandering farther than he should have. He had climbed onto the old plow to peek into the lean-to, stepped where the boards looked solid, and dropped straight through. He had shouted until his throat hurt. At some point after dark, he heard scratching and thought at first it was the cat again. Then he heard howling. "I knew somebody would come," he said from the hospital bed, voice small but certain. Harold had to step into the hallway after hearing that. The barn wall was repaired before the week ended. Harold tore out the entire back section, filled the trench, and rebuilt the foundation properly with concrete and new timber. He found more rotten voids than he liked while doing it, and each one made him think of the child alone in the dark just on the other side of those boards. Rusty oversaw the work from a blanket by the barn door. The dog seemed older after that night, as if he had spent some hidden last reserve of strength on the Howling. He slept even deeper. His joints stiffened worse in the mornings, but for a while he seemed content in a way Harold couldn't explain. Caleb's family came by often after the boy came home, always with treats Rusty wasn't supposed to have and gratitude too large to fit in ordinary conversation. One afternoon in April, Caleb himself came walking up the porch with a bright blue cast covered in signatures. He carried a paper bag from the bakery in town. "I brought him bacon," he said solemnly. "Your mother know that?" Harold asked. Caleb nodded. "She said he earned it." Rusty, from his place by the door, lifted his head at the smell and gave the faintest thump of his tail. Caleb knelt beside him carefully, cast and all, and fed him one strip at a time. When he was done, he wrapped both arms around the old dog's neck and buried his face in the fur there. Rusty stayed completely still, then leaned his head against the boy's shoulder like he understood every bit of it. Harold looked away toward the yard and pretended to inspect the weather. By summer, the story had settled into local legend. People still told it at the feed store and after church, and while leaning on tailgates at the grain elevator. Some said Rusty had heard the boy through the wall despite being deaf. Others insisted dogs could feel distress in ways no one understood. Harold never argued either version. "All I know," he would say, "is that he kept howling until I paid attention." Rusty died in late August. Not in pain, not in fear, just old. Harold found him one quiet morning on the porch, stretched in a patch of sunlight, gone as gently as any living thing could hope to go. June cried openly. Harold buried the dog beneath the cottonwood tree near the barn where Rusty used to sleep in summer when he was young. At the funeral, if it could be called that, it was only Harold, June, Caleb, and Caleb's parents. The boy placed a small wooden plaque at the base of the tree. Harold had whittled it himself, hands unsteady enough that June had painted the letters for him. It read, "Rusty, he heard what we couldn't." For a long time afterward, Harold still woke some nights expecting to hear that impossible howl. When the wind moved across the barn roof in a certain way, or the horses shifted suddenly in their stalls, he would sit up in bed and listen to the silence Rusty had left behind. And every time he walked past the rebuilt back wall of the barn, he thought of how close grief had come, of how easily a forgotten weak spot in old timber could have become a grave, of how an ancient half-deaf dog, written off by everyone as finished with useful work, had stood at a wall in the middle of the night and refused to let a child die behind it. Harold never stopped being humbled by that, because on the night it mattered most, when younger ears had heard nothing and stronger bodies had slept on, it was the oldest creature on the farm who understood that something precious was trapped in the dark and made enough noise to bring the world running.